terrible to see me, but it's nice to see you all. Really a pleasure to be here for CSP's 4-part masterclass with me, Marc Epstein, live from Poughkeepsie. And the topic of the class, this is the second of 4 classes on Chassidus in relation to history, tradition, and reform. And as we said last time, it is what these 4 classes do is really set up the place of Chassidus in the wider panoply of Jewish life, Jewish lore, Jewish culture, and we are going to set it up and then explore each of the topics in depth in Chassidus. Let me get some light here. This is better. Let's put away my student's poetry that he shared with me, which I'm going to have to tell him is somewhat derivative, but very nice that he shared it. Let's get going. As you may know, I teach at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Been teaching here for 30 years. If you want to know anything about liberal arts education and what's going on now in liberal arts colleges, current political climate, I'd be glad to talk about it at some point, but that's another topic of conversation. Let me just see. There's a couple of people in the chat.
Regards from East Midwood Day School.
Thank you. Oh, somebody is waving. Mark. Hi, Mark. What did you say? I missed you. Can you hear?
Regards from East Midwood Day School.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, or Rabbi Harry Halpern Day School, as it used to be called. That's my alma mater. I went there through 6th grade. That neighborhood has changed. It's of course become quite a Syrian and Haredi neighborhood. And all right, so I ask everybody to mute. And I want to thank our partners who range from San Diego to Gramercy Park in New York, from Needham, Massachusetts, to the San Fernando Valley. Really, really wonderful to be here. And this 4-part masterclass is dedicated in honor of Cliff and Sarah Cornell. Thank you, Cliff and Sarah. Ari Katz, who is the fearless guide of this enterprise, is currently in Israel and will be back. I think they're having their last day of their wonderful tour today. Last time we talked about 2 currents in Judaism, as long as there's been a Judaism, which are the halachic current, Jewish legal current, and the mystical current. And we asked if they are inimical to one another, and we concluded that there were mystics who were, there were lawyers who were mystics, and mystics who were lawyers. That is, the general ambit of mystical thought was not antinomian, was not against halacha. There were people in the fringes of mystical thought, of course, and we'll discuss them as we go along, who rejected halacha or tried to retool Jewish law in order to suit what they considered to be an apocalyptic moment. Actually, I'm teaching a course beginning in January at Vassar called, well, when I started teaching here at Vassar 30 years ago, it was called Jesus Christ and the Holy Gospels. That's before I taught it. It's now called something like 100 Gospels and the Confused, Conflicted Life of Jesus. Not that Jesus's life was confused or conflicted to himself, but that the scholarship is all over the place. I try to sort of shake that out. And one of the things that we discuss in that class is that halacha, Jewish law, which many people think, well, Jesus was opposed to Jewish law, or some people say Jesus fulfilled Jewish law, right? Messianics would say that, or Jesus was within the ambit of Jew. The fact is that halacha had not at that point developed. It was in a process of developing. And so the relationship of people to halacha, your mileage might vary. By the time we come to Kabbalistic developments in the Middle Ages, and when we come to Chassidut, halacha, Jewish law, is a thing, and one needs to define oneself with regard to it. And so, as I said, there were some people who define themselves as outside the ambit, some people who were keen about retooling it to move to the side of chesed, of love, of inclusivity. Other people reacted and closed down Jewish law much more, and that's in fact a historical process. So what you begin to see is that in the 20th century, can you please mute? I hear people are unmuted. Let's see, mute all. I'll mute you. In the 20th and 21st century, Hasidim are notorious for being closed and insular, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And so we talked about that last time, just recapping a little bit, the relationship between law and mysticism. And we said that the two were not incompatible, but that the way mystics interpreted the law could be somewhat fungible. And I actually want to give one quick example now, because I didn't get to it last time. And this will give some of you who weren't here last time the opportunity to understand what I was talking about. So let's think of a simple, or not so simple, because they're never simple, halakha, the obligation to pray at certain times of day, right? This emerges from the ancient rabbinic structure, which sought, in the absence of the temple and the sacrifices, to, how could you say it, to reproduce that structure. So in the morning and the afternoon, sacrifices were offered, morning and evening, let's say, not night, but morning and evening. And without sacrifice, in the absence of sacrifice, prayer replaces sacrifice. But since there's going to be a morning and an evening sacrifice, one needs to ask, quite rightly, what is morning, right? Because I'm up at 5 o'clock Eastern Daily Time every day, but for you, morning may not be until 11:30 in the morning after you've had your coffee, right? Edward's yawning a bit, so he may not have had his coffee yet. So, it could be that we have different definition of morning. So halakha moves in with a certain kind of urgency to define morning relative to the position of the sun in the sky and to your geography and to your longitude and latitude, all of that, right? So morning becomes a very specific thing. And if one offers the morning prayer, right, it has to be in the morning. If you miss the zman, the time, right, then you've missed the morning prayer. You've prayed, but you've not acquitted your responsibility to say the morning prayer in the morning, okay? Hassidim were like, oh, really? Right? What's the aim of this prayer thing anyway? If it's to connect ourselves with something bigger or something larger, something beyond, right? It can't simply be an exercise of saying the proper words at the proper time, right? They said, we say the proper words at the proper time, right? Because we don't want to make anybody a sinner. As long as you've said the proper words at the proper time, you've acquitted your responsibility. But what really is the duty of the heart, right? What really is the duty of the heart? All great thinkers in Judaism have thought in this direction, right? And that is to make this connectedness through prayer. So let's say I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I haven't had my coffee and I'm not into it. I can't sort of get it up mentally, right? To pray, emotionally, to be there. Okay, so I'll daven the morning prayer. I'll daven Shacharis a little bit later. Maybe I'll miss this month. So the mystic who's interested in the duties of the heart opines that such duties trump the duties of halakha, right? And so Hasidim traditionally were very sloppy about prayer times. They davened quite late, very often. They davened when the Spirit moved them. There were Hasidic rabbis who didn't say Havdalah, the prayer ending the Sabbath, until Monday morning. They stayed in Shabbos, some of them, all throughout Sunday. That's an exaggeration. There's one Rebbe I know, the Amshinover Rebbe, who did that, but others might have stayed hours after Shabbos ended in Shabbos because they couldn't, spiritually, mystically, they couldn't let Shabbos go. And even though the halacha is that you can say Havdalah when there are 3 stars in the sky, right? They waited because they, like a person who's with someone they love, they did not want to be distanced from that precious Shabbos, right? So again, the duties of the heart trumped the halachic parameters. Now, it's not really a halachic problem to say Havdalah later. You can say Havdalah theoretically till Monday morning, right? But Shabbos is over when Shabbos is over. But it is a problem to say the morning prayer when it's not the morning, because then it's not the morning prayer. Can I give you one more example? These are to me so fascinating, right? So when you do shechita, when you engage in slaughtering an animal, I was going to get my knife for doing shechita on birds, on chickens, but apparently it's disappeared because my wife doesn't want the kids to get their hands on it, which is smart. So I started learning the laws of shechita. I got as far as bedikas hasakin, the checking the knife, right? And so I didn't get very far. But one thing I know is that a shechita knife has to be very, very sharp, because it's intended, and please, vegetarians and vegans, forgive me, right? It's intended to sever the jugular very quickly without catching on anything and without severing the windpipe, okay? So the knife has to be very sharp, but if you make it too sharp, it can nick easily. And if it nicks and catches, then the shechita, the slaughter, is invalid. Hassidim understood, in their mystical understanding of things, that the soul of everything that you're about to eat contains within it sparks of the divine. This is the Lurianic model of Kabbalah, the fallen sparks that have fallen into everything. And if I'm in the store and I pick out a particular chicken, I think I'm picking out a chicken, right? But that chicken was destined for me because I need to consume it and release the sparks into it, back into their source in the upper worlds, right? So if that chicken is slaughtered improperly, if that chicken has caused pain, Tsar Balei Chaim, in its slaughter, that's a big problem. So Hasidim made their knives extra sharp, so sharp that they were susceptible to nicks, rather than have dull knives that can injure the animal. Not because they loved animals so much, though they might have, right? But because they wanted to release the soul in the most effective way. And so Misnagdim, the opponents of Hasidim, did not eat Hasidic shechita, did not eat slaughter that came from Hasidim, and vice versa, because for the Misnagdim, the knives were too sharp and they could nick and invalidate. And for the Hasidim, the knives of the Misnagdim were too dull, right? So 2 Jews, 3 opinions, classic example. So let's get into the topic for today, which is the idea of sectarianism and denominationalism. When I say the word denomination, it may occur to you that this is a very Protestant idea, right? In pre-modernity, Christianity sprung originally from a Jewish sect, as you know, and branched off east and west, right? With Eastern and Western churches regarding themselves as the only true, holy, and Catholic, meaning universal church, right? So you had Eastern Orthodox, which called itself the true Orthodox and Catholic Church, and Western Orthodoxy, Western Catholicism, which called itself the true Catholic Church. And it wasn't until the 16th century of the period of the Reformation, when things split further, that Protestantism, a protest against Catholicism, emerged, and Protestantism fragmented into multifarious denominations. If I showed you a chart, you would think it was crazy. There's 1 million denominations, 1 million different flavors and kinds of Protestants. That model, since America started as a country with essentially Congregationalist Protestant, Unitarian Congregationalist Protestant values, that model of denominationalism was later applied to Judaism. And now we speak of Judaism as having denominations. But I want to talk about where this began. What's the difference between sectarianism and denominationalism? What are the limits of diversity? When I was at the Hebrew University, I had a class with Isaiah Gaffney, who you may remember. He's a great, great professor of Second Temple period Judaism, and his class was called Sects and Parties in Second Temple Judaism. And those of us who enrolled in it were very chagrined to discover on the first day that it was sects and parties spelled S-E-C-T-S, as in religious sects, and political parties in the Second Temple period. But that really raises, or puts it, that really is indicative of the problem. There were many, many different kinds of groups within Judaism. Jews were incredibly geographically, ethnically, theologically, linguistically, liturgically diverse. And Hasidism created a new distinction between and among Jews at a very late period of Jewish history. We'll start at a very early period in a second. It is so significant that the opponents of Hasidism when it arose, were called Misnagdim, just opponents, right? So you know that a movement is strong when its opponents are not called by a positive designation, the Talmudists, the Jewish learningists, right? The yeshiva-ists, right? But they're called the opponents of Hasidism. That's how powerful Hasidism was. Now, in the pre-modern period, beginning with antiquity and continuing really through the Enlightenment, Emancipation, the early modern and modern ages, and the Shoah, the relationship of Jews and others was what I would, if I borrow a model from biological science, was a semi-permeable membrane. That is, Jews and others in their societies, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, pagans, interacted with each other. They lived, for the most part, in the same spaces. It wasn't until the early 1500s in Venice, right, at the tail end of the Renaissance, which Burckhardt most portentously and pretentiously and sonorously described as the time of the discovery of the world and of man, right? That Jews were placed into restricted neighborhoods called ghettos. But previous to that, even in the terrible dark Middle Ages, as some people imagine them, Jews lived not only among others, but in the center of the lives of others, because Jews were often protected by the state, by the king, or by the church. And so Jews lived cheek by jowl with the great cathedrals in Europe, cheek by jowl with the king's palace, right, for the purpose of being protected. It wasn't until really the secular American model of the 20th century that we begin to see isolated communities of Jews, Hasidic Jews, for instance, living in places like the American shtetl, as David Meyer and Naomi Stoltenberg put in their wonderful book, of Kiryas Yoel in Monroe, New York, the Satmar Hasidim, living in an enclosed, not literally enclosed, but a hermetic kind of community. That's actually a product of American secularity, the idea of the Protestant city on a hill, right? The city of the saints. That wasn't the way it was in Europe. Not Poland, not medieval Germany, not at all. There were Jews living alongside Christians, as I said, and Jews living alongside other Jews whose values were radically different from them. There were occasionally circles of pietists, right, who gathered around particular charismatic and learned figures and were especially scrupulous in religious observance. But even those people we know, because a lot of their literature deals with the question of what to do when I'm walking down the street and I see, God forbid, a woman, right, or a dog, which seemed to have been the same thing for some of these groups, which were very retrograde in their gender enlightenment, let's say, right? What do I do? Now, if they lived segregated in their own place that question would never have come up, right? So people lived together and they were incredibly diverse. From the very earliest periods of Jewish history for which there are historians, right? But even earlier in the Bible is not a history book. It doesn't pretend to be a history book, right? But the Bible records the divergence of the Jews and their eventually near cousins, the Samaritans, right? Over certain issues involving sovereignty and kingship and the center of Jewish life, where it should be, etc. So even in the Bible, there is sectarianism. By the time we meet the Jewish historian, Roman historian, Josephus Flavius, we know very famously that both in his Wars and Antiquities, he describes at least 3, but maybe even 5 different groups of Jews with different theologies, different politics, different religious impulses and religious styles, right? Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Therapeutae, Sicarii, Zealots, right? That's 6 that I'm listing, right? And the range is awesome. Or shall I say, the range is what we might expect from politically quietistic, like we're living under Roman occupation, let's not make trouble, right? To, yeah, let's stab those Romans in the back, literally, right? A whole range of political opinions. Another divergency among Jews in that early period is with regard to the role of text and tradition. You had people who were, so to speak, religious civil service employees, the priests, who were hereditary descendants of Aaron, Moses' brother, and carried this priesthood down from generation to generation. And while the Jerusalem temples yet stood, were the religious functionaries who offered sacrifices, who preserved physically the sacred scriptures, who issued declarations of what was pure and impure, etc., etc. The Sadducees, the descendants of Tzadok, very important high priest, and of the Aaronic line. And they were the establishment. But there were other Jews who were uncomfortable with that model, right? They said, look, what does it matter if somebody's father was a priest? Doesn't make them necessarily a good leader. And we'll talk about leadership models next time, right? But just this is a little preview. Doesn't make them a good leader. Heredity doesn't dictate. I mean, it may be that somebody who's good at doing something can teach their child how to do it well. But simple genetics, you may have all the genetics to be a wonderful pianist, but unless you practice, you're not going to just spring fully formed from the head of Chopin, right? So there was opposition to that position. And people said, well, the Torah itself seems to speak of a 2-tier approach to connection with the ultimate, to connection with divinity. One approach is through the sacrifices and through the temple, and the other approach seems to be through scripture itself, that one should speak of it and study it and seek within it and derive and distill laws from it. And there was a group of people who opposed the establishment. They were called the Prushim, the opposition, the Protestants, the separatists, the Misnagdim, right? Misnagdim that early in history, right? Protestants that early in history, Prushim, the Pharisees, and they separated themselves from the priestly class. They say, hey, I can't claim descent from Aaron, but I can claim descent from Adam, right? That's pretty good. Adam is a long lineage, right? I'm a person, you're a person. We both learn Torah, and we strive for excellence in the learning of the Torah. And whoever it learns best and teaches best, not just learns it and retains it, but gets it and can pass it on, that person is worthy of being called a master, a Rav, a rabbi, right? So you had Sadducees, the priestly class, doing their thing in the temple, the Pharisees, right, learning Torah and promoting people in their hierarchy on the basis of how much they could learn and teach. And then you had all kinds of people in the desert running around and being celibate proto-monastics. That's where Christian monasticism comes from, right? The Essenes and the Dead Sea sect and Therapeutii, other people who were around the Judean scene, but were not in the cities, were not Pharisees studying law, were not priests in the temple, and they might have had a more mystic, messianic view. It's harder to understand what exactly they were doing, but you see already a tremendous diversity. And that's really important because that diversity will carry on. By the way, you may think this is a class on Hasidism. Why am I talking about Pharisees and Sadducees? Because the essential Pharisee-Sadducee split, that is between people who are connecting somehow with God through some kind of mediation that's non-verbal, and people who are studying texts, is a split that appends eventually to Hasidim and Misnagdim. So there are ideological splits. A little bit later in history, by the 8th, 9th, 10th century, once the temple is destroyed for a while already, once, guess who are in the ascendancy? Not the Sadducees, because when the temple is destroyed, they are out of a job, right? But the Pharisees, right? Those people who were learning texts and continue to learn texts, starting in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and then more strongly throughout the Gaonic period, when the law is consolidated, when rabbinics, the Talmud, beginning with the Mishnah and then the Gemara, have developed to a high degree. Eventually you have people come along and under the influence of the larger Muslim world, where there was a sort of fundamentalist push at that period of history, that is back to the sources. Let's talk about the Quran itself and not talk so much about the tafsir, the commentary, or all the accreted, oh, my light just went out. Okay. You can see me still. All the accreted credescences upon the Quran. There were Jews who said, let's go back to the pure Torah. Let's read the Torah. They were called Karaim, readers. Let's understand its grammar. Let's think about its messages. Let's derive its laws, right? And let's not be interested in the entirety of rabbinic tradition. Now, that was a big ask, I have to say. It's a huge ask, because if you open up the Torah and it says, observe the Sabbath, you shall not labor on the Sabbath, right? So for me, right, not laboring means, I sit in my my lawn chair and I drink my margarita and I listen to the radio, right? The last thing I'm doing is mowing my lawn, because I hate to mow my lawn. For me, that's a lot of work. For Ahava Cecilia, she loves to mow the lawn. When she's out there, she puts in her, theoretically, she loves to mow the lawn. She's mowing the lawn out there, right? She's having a great time. That's her rest and recreation, right? So just as we had to determine when morning was, because I'm up at 5 and Chuck is up at, almost noon. See, he's not even up now, okay? So, I'm up at 5 and Chuck is almost up at noon. We had to determine what morning means. So too for the laws of Sabbath rest. What does rest mean? So if I'm a Karaite and I open up the Bible, it says to rest. Well, if everybody is resting according to their own sort of mental construct of what rest is, whatever suits a person, kol ish as hayasha be'enav ya'aseh, right? Everyone should do according to what they want. Then you have no community. Then you have no consistency. Then you can't teach about the Sabbath and its laws, right? So Karaism was problematic. But again, why am I talking about an 8th, 9th, 10th century movement? Because there are parallels with Hasidism. Hasidism also inquired and thought about the values that were central to its society. in the society in which Hasidism was born, there was what Hasidim described as a dry Talmudism. That is, an interest in and an obsession with halakha, Jewish law, and the codes, and their exposition, and the knowledge of law, and Pharisaism to the nth degree, right? And pilpul, that is argumentation about the law. Hasidim said, that might be the number one value. But for us, we're interested, like eventually the Quakers in Protestantism, right? Of what Ruach HaKodesh is telling us, what the Holy Spirit is telling us. When the Spirit moves us, we pray, right? Not according to the halachic calendar. Now, this is early Hasidism. Later Hasidism became very nomian, very connected with law, very, very obsessed with law, as we'll see. But just as the Karaites rejected full force, right, the rabbinic structure of interpretation, and they actually had to create structures of interpretation of their own, because you can't just open up the Bible and observe. People have tried, but it doesn't have legs. You can, as an individual, make your own decisions, right? But it's not a communal thing. And you would say, wow, how could you have a Judaism that rejects the Talmud, right? Hasidism was a Judaism that in the early time, though it respected it for its adherents, rejected Talmudism. That is a strong and exclusive emphasis on text. So that's just a few examples of the ideological breadth of Judaism. Geographically, too, as you know, Jews were very, very diverse. Already in biblical times, if we count the book of Esther, right, and the books of Nehemiah Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah, excuse me, I just have something stuck in my throat. Ezra, Nehemiah Chronicles, we see that Jews were dispersed already from a very early period. That's because when the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, just as when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, it was the best thing that possibly could have happened to humans, right? Because let's face it, do you want to stay in a playpen your whole life, right? With a bunch of cute little animals? You want to be out there in the world. Yes, there's suffering. Yes, there's death. But a lived life is a lived life. Whereas a protected, bounded, non-lived life is something terrible. And so the Babylonian exile, which resulted in terrible displacement and terrible suffering for Jews, once the Jews got to Babel, a lot of them liked it there. And they had even earlier models, Jews who had gone to Egypt and stayed in Egypt at various points in history, creating strong diaspora communities in Alexandria and even on the island of Elephantine, in which there was a temple dedicated to the Jewish God, in which some kind of sacrifices, grain, incense, it's unclear, were offered, right? Jews very early became a diaspora people. And so you began to see as well geographic diversity. And geographic diversity is not simply about style, that a Jew who comes from the East is wearing a turban and pointy shoes, and a Jew who comes from the West is wearing an Armani suit. It's not only about sartorial style. It's not only about culinary style, that Jews in Syria like to eat kibbeh and hamin, and Jews in Poland like to eat stuffed cabbage and cholent, right? It's not only about linguistic style, that Jews in Italy might speak Judeo-Italkit, which is an amalgam of Hebrew and Italian, but even when they speak Hebrew, it's with an Italian accent, right? Something I learned when I used to go regularly to the Italian shul in Jerusalem on 23 Hillel Street. It's worth checking out. But I won't imitate the Italian accent in Hebrew lest I sound completely weird, but you have to trust me. It's not only any of those things that are externals of the way Jews are and behave. But the fact that, as I've said before, Jews are tofu. Jews are tofu. When you take Jews and you dip them into a culture, they, just as tofu absorbs the taste of chicken or beef or vegetables or mushrooms or whatever you put it in with, Jews absorb not only the sartorial style, culinary style, linguistic style, but the mental, emotional mindset of the places in which they live. In that sense, it's very ironic to think of Jews as always being the quintessential strangers and outsiders, because although they obviously did maintain their customs and their values, they were very much inflected, not infected, right? But inflected with the values of the cultures in which they lived. And so the Jews who had gone to Bavel developed the Babylonian Talmud. Now you might ask, where was Judaism born? And there are a number of answers for that. You could say Mesopotamia, because that's where Abraham came from. You could say the land of Israel, because Kol Od Belevav, right? As long as there's a pintala yid, a little piece of a Jew in the Jewish heart, the soul of a Jew turns east, right? Eretz Zion, Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, right? But the truth is that the Judaism that most of us practice in Encino or Westminster or Needham or, God help us, Poughkeepsie, is Babylonian Judaism. It originates in the Babylonian Talmud, which, unlike the Jerusalem Talmud, is very much concerned, very thickly, very deeply concerned with Jewish-Gentile relationships, with the relationships of people, Jews and others in the same culture, right? Whereas the Judaism of the land of Israel was much more insular. It was much more concerned with being a people under occupation than being a minority population among others, right? And so you have two completely different takes on what it means to be a Jew. Al achas kama v'kama, how much more so if you were a Jew whose diaspora was West Africa or Ethiopia or China or India or Persia, right? How different your culture and your outlook would be. I just told you that one of the earliest, biggest splits in Jewish religious culture were the Karaites, and they were influenced by their Muslim environment, right? By the purists who wanted Quran only, right? Just like today we have fundamentalists who want the Bible only. Give me 1 second. I'm going to blow my nose and I'm going to stop my video because why should you watch that? Thank you. Okay. That's nice. You can be polite in that way in this day and age, but you heard it nonetheless, so you know that the nose was blown. If a nose is blown and you don't hear it, has it been blown? Think about that for next time. Okay, or comment in the comments. You have this inflection with the flavor of the time and place. Okay, now this applies. For instance, my great hero, the Rambam, Moses Maimonides. I love the Rambam. I live my life as much as I can according to the Mishnah Torah, the Yad HaChazakah of Marana Rambam, right? Because he is clear, he is concise, he is precise. He doesn't go for any bullshit or any superstition or any nonsense. He's like logical about everything, you know. Even when he reads the Torah, right? Jacob is wrestling with an angel. He says, "What? An angel? You think Jacob's physically wrestling with an angel? No, Jacob is grappling with the archetype of his brother Esau. It's a Freudian understanding, right? Brilliant, very, very brilliant. But then you read the Rambam a little bit more in a few places, and he says, well, we don't trust women to do X, Y, Z because Nashim datan kalat alehen. Women, their knowledge or their reason or their logic sits lightly upon them. Right? Or he talks about, just like a medieval person, right? He talks about the four corners of the earth, and he says that obviously the people in northern latitudes, because it's cooler and it cools the brain, they're more high-minded than the people at the extremities of the South. Huh? Right? Well, Maimonides, like any Jew, is a person of his time and his place. He assimilated ideas about women, not only from the Talmud, which has plenty of those ideas, but from the Arab culture around him. He was an Arab Jew, right? His language was Judeo-Arabic. And he assimilated his ideas about geography and its influence on brain chemistry, right, from medieval science, the latest and the greatest in medieval science. So wherever a Jew is, a Jew will assimilate what's going on in that place. It will not surprise you then to know that Moshe Idel, who is a great writer on Jewish mysticism, great scholar, but also has written several interesting books, particularly about Chassidus, is of the opinion that Hasidic practice, certain practices of hisbodedus, right, of being alone, meditative aloneness with God, come from the fact that the Baal Shem Tov lived in the Carpathian Mountains, was a simple person, a shepherd, it seems, and a folk healer. And he learned his folk healing from local folk healers, probably a lot of women. And he learned his meditative practices, or he emulated the meditative practices of solitary Orthodox monks, right? That is Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox monks, right? Who are living in caves in that very region. And Idel compares the meditative practices of the Baal Shem Tov as they've come down to us with others, right? You yourselves know the best example of Hasidic assimilation of the wider culture, right? Which is the Hasidic dress, which in all its details, from the shaving of heads and foreheads for men, and to the kapotas and the bekishes, the long coats, which are riding coats turned up at the back, to the zokin, the socks, and and the slippers with buckles instead of ties, and the furry hats. All of that comes from the stratum of the Polish Ukrainian nobility of that period. Streimels and spodeks are military kind of hats, adapted, of course. So even Hasidim, who seem so singular and so different, are in fact a group that is assimilating what's going on among them. I'll give you one more example, brilliant example of the Kalavar Rebbe. The Kalavar Rebbe was, again, a simple guy. We'll talk about Rebbes and rabbis next time. What's the difference? And to put it al regel achas on one, at one time, the phrase al regel achas, usually translated as on one foot, really means instantaneously. It's not al rega achad. Rega is a moment, but al regel achad on one occasion. Right, we have the shalosh regalim, the three times, appointed times. So al regal achas doesn't mean that you stand on one foot when I tell you this, like we were all taught in Hebrew school about Hillel and the centurion, right? You know that story that a centurion comes to Hillel and says, "Tell me everything there is to know about Judaism as I stand on one foot." And Hillel says, "If it bothers you, don't do it to others." That's the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go learn it, right? And we had this vision and maybe a picture in our book of the centurion standing on one leg. It just means tell me in one bavat achat, in one session, right, at one moment. Okay, so just to summarize that the Rebbes and rabbis, a Rebbe is usually somebody who's a charismatic leader, and is not necessarily, though he can be, a learned person. And the Kalavar Rebbe was a simple person who used to take long meditative walks, a la the Baal Shem Tov's practice, a la the practice of Eastern Orthodox monks in the forests in Hungary, where he lived. And once he heard a song in the forest. Sola kakoshman, in matman, da 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 da. He loved the song. It was about the crow crowing for the dawn, And as he heard the song, he heard it, the crow is crowing for the dawn of redemption. Because, if you're a mystic and a chassid, you see redemptive possibilities at every footstep. And he wanted to use the tune, both as a meditative aid, as a nigun, a wordless tune, but also to put words to it that would be Hasidic words. But he didn't feel comfortable, you see. So he went to the little shepherd boy who he heard singing it or playing on a pipe, it's unclear, and he purchased the tune. He said, I'll give you some gelt, right, for this tune, right? And he like Abraham buying the cave of the Machpelah, right? Kesef over the cash directly to the seller, right? He purchased the tune. Now that is a metaphor for the whole idea of diversity and denominationalism, which I'll discuss in a second to end with. The diversity of the world coming into even as insular a practice as Chassidus. And the idea of paying for it is almost you could say, nowadays we'd say an intellectual property question, right? I realize that this isn't mine. I need some way to be mekudash, to make it holy, but I can't make anything holy that I've stolen. Lulav hagazel pasel, right? If you use a lulav that's been stolen, it's not usable for sukkahs, right? So he couldn't steal the two, and that's what happens. There is adoption, but also adaptation. So how did we get to, I don't know, secular humanist, reconstructionist, secular humanist, renewal, reconstructionist, reform, conservative, orthodox, ultra-orthodox, split into Misnagdish and Chassidish, what is Haredi, what are all those things? And where does Hasidism fit into that spectrum? Hasidism was the first Jewish reform movement. Before classical reform in Germany, Hasidim were radically reforming Judaism. Listen, baby, if you don't think that turning somersaults in shul and getting good and drunk and davening whenever you want and sharpening your knives so the chickens will feel no pain or less pain is radical and is reforming and saying, no, we don't want to study your stinking Talmud all the time, right? If you don't think that's radical and reforming, you got another thing coming, right? Chassidus was a tremendous reform. It didn't stray too far from Nomianism, from application of the halachic law, but it strayed tremendously from orthodoxy. It was unorthodox. Does anybody know, you're in California, know anybody at Netflix? Because I'd like to, no, okay. It was, yeah, okay, there you go, Faith. It was unorthodox, right? And it was very progressive and very radical and very inclusive of everybody in new and different ways. You could say that the Hasidic Weibel, the housewife, was as repressed, suppressed, and oppressed as any pre-Hasidic woman. But you see, if you were in the thing, for you, it was kind of a fresh thing. You were still the handmaid. It was the handmaid's tale, but you were a handmaid to a new kind of Jew who was involved in a new kind of project. And as some of you may know, who lived in postmodern times, right? If you were a woman in 1950 something, yes, you might have felt unfulfilled career-wise. You probably did, unless you were, a very forward thinking woman, and you had a lot of emancipation. But a lot of nachas that women in pre-liberated times got was from what their husbands were doing. They sort of felt part of that, or they were misayea, they were aiding that. So when Hasidus took the world by storm, women's position also changed within the ambit of a repressed and repressive culture for women. And so you might, so when we talk about reform, Chassidus is the first reform. In the 19th century in Germany, there was the famous reform which involved the synagoguification of Judaism, right? Let's take it out of the home, right? Off the street, right? Let's put it in the synagogue where people can go nicely on Saturday or Friday night only, or maybe Saturday or maybe Sunday, right? Where they can listen to beautiful choral music and an organ in a language they understand, and where they can sit in theater-style pews, just like in a nice, orderly Protestant church, not chuckling, davening, screaming, shouting, singing, banging on tables, getting drunk, sermons in Yiddish, right? Enough of that energy, right? Let's have a sort of Protestant energy, rabbis in robes, shaved faces, right? That, and an emphasis on the ethical, right? Judaism is ethical monotheism, right? We're not worrying, right, what we put into our mouths. We're worrying what comes out of them, as Jesus said, right? So, Reform, somebody once said Jesus would have been a very happy Reformed Jew, because in early Reform, it was really about ethical monotheism. Reformed Judaism has evolved a lot, right? And then in response to that, something emerged called orthodoxy. It's astounding to think that before Reform Judaism in Germany, there was no orthodoxy. Jews said we were traditional Jews. What they believed, they believed. They kept it to themselves, right? If it was strange. But as a response to Reform Judaism, Jews in Central, East Europe, Western Europe said, we got to get our act together. We're traditional Jews. We want none of that reform. We need to define ourselves, what we believe, what we do, right? But we also want to be modern. We want to go to the opera, let's say. There's nothing in the Torah that says you shouldn't go to the opera, right? So let's adjust our lives so we can do that. We want to keep kosher, right? But we want to do business. We want to learn Torah, but we want to be entertained. And that was orthodoxy. For some people, beginning in Europe and then more in America, that was too much. It was too much to have these polarities. And so something called conservative Judaism, which was actually had a different name at the beginning, emerged under, and each of these movements has great leaders: Abraham Geiger for reform, the Baal Shem Tov, of course, of Chassidus, Abraham Geiger for reform, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch for orthodoxy or modern orthodoxy, Salman Schechter for conservative Judaism, and Schechter had this idea of Catholic Israel. He called it using that old sense of Catholic, universal Israel. What the people do is really determinative, and we do not abandon halacha, but nor do we stick to it in a way that seems like we can't live with it. V'chai bahem, right? Conservative Judaism tried to tread a middle ground. And then, as a result, as a reaction to those denominations, various other movements, Reconstructionism coming out of conservative Judaism, in which the value was the historical. So Mordechai Kaplan would say, I don't not build a sukkah like the classical Reform Jews, because I'm afraid of what the Goyim will think if I put this weird hut in front of my house. I don't take the sukkah and sort of construct it over the quote unquote altar in the synagogue. I don't do that. But nor do I build a sukkah because God commanded me to. What a strange thing. What if I don't believe in God, right? I build a sukkah because my ancestors built sukkot. And so Reconstructionist Judaism, reconstructing Judaism as a Judaism in which God was somewhat optional, but tradition was very, very important. And Mordechai Kaplan was not. He started out as a traditionally observant Jew, and his thoughts about God were, I think, very profound. He used to say, for instance, that God always answers prayer. Just sometimes the answer is no, which is really a profound exposition, I think, of what, if there is God, what God might mean, right? Or how we might perceive. And then as a result of a variety of pressures and a variety of shifts involving these reforms, there were certain Jews for whom modern orthodoxy did not seem enough. They saw modern orthodoxy as a slippery slope that was going to lead to conservative reform, right? Further and further down what they regarded as a slope. And they said, we're going to be Orthodox, but we're going to maintain the orthodoxy that we brought from Europe. Now, that was a lie. It wasn't a conscious lie, but it was not true. Modern and postmodern, what's called ultra-orthodoxy or Haredism, trembling before God, is a construct of the 20th and 21st century. It's a nostalgic kind of reinvention of what one imagined came before. The remnants of the Hassidim who came to America, who were decimated in the Shoah and came to America and rebuilt their communities somewhat in Europe in certain places and massively in Israel. These were changed people. They were really a new denomination, really a postmodern Hasidus. There is something called post-Hasidic Judaism, which is interesting, or neo-Hasidic Judaism. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the people that I come from, who were American versions of European Hasidim, right? It was very different than it was in Europe. First of all, there was a city on the hill mentality, as I said, sort of closing of the wagon. What is it called in early American, when the wagons, gather around? What is that? There's a word for that. Somebody can unmute and tell me.
Corral.
Circling.
They're circling the
wagons.
Circling the wagons.
Okay, now I'm muting you all. So thank you. Circling the wagons, a very sort of closed and insular approach. And it is a shockingly different Hasidism than the Hasidism that we will talk about as we proceed. I see, as my shrink says, that we are about out of time. I want to look at some of these statements in the chat and say a little bit about them and then sort of preview next time. Bimia is correct. I never said that Jesus was against the law. I said earlier that there was not a law to be against yet. The law was information, and Jesus's halachic positions, something we could talk about in another series. If you want me to do it, you could ask Ari. Jesus's halachic positions were pre-halachic, right? But of course they addressed the law. There was no way not to address the law in that, but that was what being a Jew was. Yes, traditionally in CSP, one cannot chat with the other participants. That's the way it works. A little bit of messages of the Aaronite priests were banished from David on, and the Tzadokite line, as I said, was the line that the Sadducees claimed descent from. Thank you, Ahuva. That is excellent. Let's see. Okay, I don't want to talk about Ben Sira and Maccabees right now. That's an interesting question. When will a recording be available? I can't tell you that. That's up to Ari Katz. You'll have to write him. Yeah, you know what, Edward? It is an irony that Hasidim wear Polish clothes. It is, but this is going to sound silly, but I don't mean it in a silly way. Their fashion is unstoppable, right? You see something, you know. What can I say? I'm gonna now. You're gonna hate on me. So my wife is Hungarian. She's very dedicated to Judaism. She's a Maharat. She's an Orthodox rabbi, and she teaches Talmud and rabbinics at Vassar. And when she was young, she trained as an opera singer, and she happened to love Wagner, right? So I'm like, how could you love Wagner? How? Right? Hitler loved Wagner. Wagner was a racist. Blah blah. I said, oh, but the music is the music. I hate Wagner. I hate the music, and I hate Wagner. Right? But for some people, it's these things can be uncoupled. And I think for Hasidim as a whole, they were interested in being elegant, and they didn't have another model for elegance. And so that's what they assumed. Okay, Deborah Berkowitz, yes, joyous Judaism. Hasidism had, as we'll see, probably in the second series, moments in which there was a psycho-spiritual impulse toward godless, that is expansiveness and joy, right? And then interiority and a sort of darkness. And it had both. And I think that the celebrations were intended to lift Jews up in the abjectness of their exile. I did talk about Karaites at the very beginning. Yes, okay. Thank you all. You are wonderful. I'm looking very much forward to seeing you next week. This is the highlight of my week. Like I say, I can talk to 18 to 22-year-olds every day, which is okay, but you're people who have life experience. I can make a reference that happened more than 7 minutes ago, let alone the Jebusites, Ahuva, right? And you know what I'm talking about, which is really great. So I send you all my love and have a great week. And remember to be nice to each other. Okay? Be well.